Hey folks, today I'd like to talk about Sean Connery, who passed away just at the end of October recently. And so, an interesting study in Neechabhanga, as we will shortly see. Now, when Sean Connery first appeared as Agent 007 in Her Majesty's Secret Service, I mean, women all over the world kind of fell into a martini state of mind where they were at least stirred, if not shaken. And many a young lass probably said, please, sir, I'd like to see more of that. And indeed, what was not to like? You know, from his late teens, Connery was working at sculpting his 6'2" physique into bodybuilding shape of sorts because he wanted to compete as Scotland's entry in Mr. Universe. When he got his James Bond role, he was almost immediately regarded as something of a sex icon because, he had a very good body. He had this somewhat exotic Scottish accent, and, a certain ability to charm. So his role was cast right from the outset. But ironically, Connery himself was not thrilled with the kind of fame that came his way via the James Bond franchise. In fact, he at one point said that he hated the role and cursed the day that he ever took it on, mostly because it typecast him into being this kind of action hero that he did not want to be saddled with for the rest of his life. So the irony of this sort of situation, fame but a grudging acceptance of it, will not be lost on any astrologer who looks at his chart and recognizes a Neechabhanga circumstance in his chart courtesy of Venus debilitated, and yet has all the support necessary to elevate it into Neechabhanga status. Now, the irony of this is that, Neechabhanga is itself a kind of a two-for-one contrarian proposition. Neecha means debilitated, so there's something wrong with it. And then the Bhanga implies some sort of resolution, an amelioration, an improvement, a resolution. Never a complete cancellation, as is erroneously thought by many. It doesn't get you all the way out of the hole, although perhaps to some degree that allows you to succeed despite it. So, as we'll see, this is a remarkable feature of Sean Connery's chart, and let's go now to the chart and have a closer look at that. So here we have Sean Connery's chart. So Sagittarius rising with Saturn in the Lagna, Rahu in the 5th, Mars, Jupiter in the 7th, Sun in its own sign in the 9th, Moon, Mercury, and Venus in the 10th, Ketu in the 11th. Let's circle back to the 10th house where we have a small cluster of benefics. But it's not going to form Amala Yoga because that cluster is aspected by Mars and it's aspected by Saturn as well. But we do have there Mercury exalted in its own sign in a Kendra, so that's Bhadra Yoga. But our attention is quickly drawn to this Venus, which is debilitated in the 10th house. And so we must ask ourselves, this debilitated Venus, the Neecha Venus, does it have Neechabhanga? So there are a number of rules for this, and so to remediate any Neecha planet, we have to ask ourselves several questions. One, is that debilitated planet in a Kendra from the ascendant or the moon? Well, as it turns out here, it is both. Wonderful. Off to a good start. So our next question is, regarding that debilitated planet, is its dispositor in a Kendra from the ascendant or the moon? Well, its dispositor is this exalted Mercury, and it too is in a Kendra, the 10th house, and in the same sign as the moon. So yes to both, a Kendra to both the Lagna and the moon. The next question we must ask ourselves is, the planet that rules the sign in which the debilitated planet would be exalted. Okay, let's follow the chain of thought. Venus is debilitated in Virgo. It would be exalted in Pisces. The ruling planet is Jupiter. And we ask that same question again. Is Jupiter, the lord of Venus's exaltation sign, is it in a Kendra from the Lagna or the moon? And again, yes to both of those. So this is a remarkable run of good fortune so far. The last question is, for the debilitated planet, is there a planet, or yes, what is the planet that would be exalted in that very sign? And in this case, it's Mercury again. Mercury here does double duty. First, as a dispositor of Venus, and secondly, as the planet which becomes exalted in that very sign. Now, they are not one and the same for every other planet that you deal with, but it is true for this Venus and Mercury in this case. So in this case, Mercury is again in a Kendra from the Lagna and from the moon. The last question we must ask ourselves is Venus's dispositor and its exaltation lord. Are they in Kendra to each other? So Venus's dispositor is Mercury, and its exaltation lord is Jupiter. And they two are in mutual Kendras. So this is really a remarkable lineup of support for Neechabhanga in Sean Connery's chart, the like of which you will rarely see. Don't take my word for it. Put a pause on this recording and go take a look through your entire chart file. I'll wait until you come back. You'll likely not find anything like this. So what happens then when Venus is elevated to this status? Well, in effect, it gives Venus something of a superpower. It's not perfect. Here's the thing about a debilitated planet, which is enabled by virtue of Neechabhanga to act much more strongly than would first appear. For an analogy, think of Venus as, or think of the debilitated planet, whichever it is, as being something like a damaged limb, let's say your leg. And whether that's been atrophied by some congenital illness or it's been damaged by an accident, no matter what prosthetics you have access to, your limb will never be 100% functional to the same degree that a natural, healthy limb might be. So it's a little bit like the $6 million man, impaired to a great degree, but supplemented and bolstered and fortified by any number of, mechanical prosthetic devices, which can make the individual powerful, as in the case of the $6 million man, but never entirely whole. There will always remain some aspect of this debilitated Venus which continues to apply in the person's life. Now, in Sean Connery's case, it was this very lucrative role as James Bond, which enabled him to command the James Bond franchise for as long as he wanted to act in that role. But he struggled mightily to get out of that, and he was not entirely happy with being typecast that way. So we look elsewhere in the chart, though, for other sources of power to explain his significant success. And a good place to start is this cluster in the 10th house. But upon inspection, we see that there is no fruitful combination here among these three benefics that forms Dharma-Karma Adhipati yogas. That's a fortuitous combination of Kendra lords and Trikona lords. There's none of that here. There are no Dhana yogas either, the sort of indicators of wealth. There's none of that. There's really just the Bhadra yoga, which is one of the Mahapurusha yogas formed by Mercury, which is not insignificant in and of itself. But that's the major source of power. This is a dark moon. being in the sign just adjacent to the sun, and this is a debilitated Venus. So it's Mercury that's got the greatest power here, and Venus, by virtue of Neechabhanga, rises above itself, if you will, to create the Venusian kind of charisma that is typical of many a movie star or other people who are very much in the public eye. Now, it's not a yoga, but you'll very often see that when Moon, Venus are either associated in the same sign or mutually aspecting each other from opposite signs, there is often a significant artistic bias or tilt to the individual. And so that's part of Sean Connery's magic here as well. Now, but he does have a number of these other yogas, the ones we always look for, Dharma-Karma Adhipati yogas. For instance, given that he has a Sagittarius rising, Jupiter is Lagnesh, and thereby it is both a Kendra Lord and a Trikona Lord. Now, it associates with Mars, and because Mars is a trinal Lord, Jupiter can function as a Kendra Lord, as Lord of the first, or as Lord of the fourth, for that matter. So it actually forms two Dharma-Karma Adhipati yogs with Jupiter and Mars. And one of those, the combination of 4 and 5, actually form what is called a Raja Yoga. So that's significant. The fact that Jupiter aspects back into its own sign is always a good thing as well, too, on a physical level and for charisma as well. Now, when we look for Dhana yogas, the easy thing to do is first see who are the money lords. So that's Saturn, Lord of the second, and Venus, Lord of the 11th. So one or the other of those must combine with a trinal lord in order to create a Dhana yoga. So in this instance, we have Jupiter, which is a trinal lord, combines in mutual aspect with Saturn. So that would be Lord of 1 and 2, combined to form one Dhana yoga. And then Mars, as Lord of a trine as well, combines with Saturn, Lord of the second, to form yet another Dhana yoga. Now, Venus is the other money lord, Lord of the 11th house, but it does not combine with any of the trinal lords. Venus would have to combine with Jupiter or Mars or Sun, of which none apply. So there's no Dhana yogas coming from Venus, but we do have two coming via association or mutual aspect, I should say more correctly, with Saturn, the Lord of the second. So two Dharma-Karma Adhipati yogas, one of which is a Raja Yoga, and two Dhana yogas formed through these three planets running across the first and the 7th house. The Dasha Bhukti sequence played out nicely on behalf of Sean Connery. The James Bond role was provided to him in 1962 when he was then running the Rahu Dasha Ketu Bhukti. Now, the nodes, as many people know, will act as proxies on behalf of any planet with which they associate, and in this case, Rahu and Ketu have no associates, or any planet which aspects them. In this case, only Jupiter aspects Ketu, or any planet which disposits them. And of course, they always have a dispositor. So Mars is the dispositor for Rahu, and Ketu, Venus is the dispositor for Ketu. So he was running Rahu Ketu when he began his James Bond franchise. And so that basically invoked Mars, and it invoked Jupiter, and it invoked Venus. All of these are in Kendras. The Mars-Jupiter pair, as we saw, each were involved in multiple yogas. The Venus forms Neechabhanga yoga, and so we've got multiple combinations, fortuitous combos, being brought forth by proxy, courtesy of the nodes in that particular Dasha Bhukti period, Rahu Ketu. He also got married during Rahu Ketu. And so, Rahu brings forth the results of Mars, its dispositor. Ketu is aspected by Jupiter. And both Mars and Jupiter sit in the 7th house of relationship. So that was, almost, handed to us in terms of obviousness. He also had his first and only son during the Rahu Ketu period as well, too. And again, Rahu invokes Mars, the lord of the 5th, and Ketu invokes Jupiter, which in this case we can look at as the Karaka for children. So then Connery was married for about 11 years, and he had a number of affairs, while he was married, and then he married again in the Jupiter-Mercury period. And that's kind of interesting as well too, because Jupiter owns the first house, and Mercury owns the 7th house. Jupiter is, powerful by being involved in these Dharma-Karma Adhipati yogas and Dhana yogas, and Mercury, of course, is, very powerful in the 10th, functioning as a Bhadra yoga. So all of this came forward in that Jupiter-Mercury period. Now, in his professional life, the Jupiter period was not entirely happy. He had recalled that he began the James Bond role in Rahu, and it continued off and on again into the Jupiter period. I mean, it certainly paid the bills and it gave him great success, but he was not a happy man during this period, and he was struggling significantly to try to break out of that role and get other things going for him. And ironically, it was not until his Saturn Dasha that he really finally received recognition for the other work that he'd been doing outside of the James Bond role. So I've forgotten the years, but you can look it up. Right at the outset of his Saturn Dasha, it was Saturn Dasha, Saturn Bhukti, when he received a British Actors Award for his part in The Name of the Rose. And then the next year, he received an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for his role in The Untouchables, a Hollywood movie. So that kind of gave him the recognition that he had been, clamoring for all these years, something other than the kind of action hero, a bit of a cartoonish figure in the James Bond role. He was finally taken as a serious actor in his Saturn Dasha, leading with Saturn Dasha, Saturn Bhukti. And then thereafter that, he was offered, more and more serious roles. And in that regard, he felt that, he had been fulfilled in what he wanted to do. Okay, so I think that'll do in terms of, there's a couple of other things. He has other yogas. He has the moon Jupiter in mutual kendras, is a Kesari yoga. It often represents a person of a certain degree of generosity. And, he donated significantly to Scottish educational institutions over the years, millions of pounds, literally. And he also lent his voice in voiceovers for advertisements for the Scottish Nationalist Party, that which, campaigned for independence of Scotland from the UK. So he had that going for him as well, too, in terms of yogas. Okay, so I think that'll do it for primary analysis of his chart, and I'll go back to some concluding remarks. Now, I neglected to mention while I had the chart up there on screen, but let me throw this in, and you can look back at the chart at your leisure. So perhaps in recognition of his years of unhappy service as 007, Sean Connery was eventually knighted by Queen Elizabeth II in July of 2000. He was then running Saturn Rahu. And if you look at the chart, Saturn is in Sambandha, full mutual aspect with Jupiter, and Rahu invokes Mars, which is in association with Jupiter. So that period, Saturn Rahu, invokes the connections with Jupiter, and Jupiter as ascendant lord is associated with what we call name and fame. And so, that represents something of a capstone achievement in his life. Then ultimately, Sean Connery died recently, and he was running Saturn Mercury at the time. And so, if you look in the chart, you'll see that Saturn is the lord of the second, therefore America, and Mercury is lord of the seventh, also America. They are both powerful planets, Saturn by virtue of being retrograde, and Mercury by virtue of being exalted. So that, spelled the end of his life. Now, I wanted to say just a little bit more in terms of concluding remarks about the Neechabhanga Venus. So as we saw, that planet helped to catapult him into the sort of movie stardom role that every actor desires. I mean, he'd spent years working in London West End theater roles and bit parts in movies before he was offered this opportunity. And he was reluctant at the outset because he was afraid it would typecast him. But he took it on, and of course it's what created his fame and allowed him to purchase homes in Monaco, Spain, Los Angeles, and the Bahamas, and gave him great comforts, disposable income, as we would say, and great luxuries. But he kind of resented it at the same time because it was not the role that he really wanted. And he is literally quoted, "I have always hated that damned James Bond, and I would kill him if I could." Well, eventually everything dies, but so it goes. He had that success nonetheless. But Venus as a karaka for, relationships and women, etc., the fact that it is Neechabhanga, although improved, repaired, reconciled to a great degree, it never becomes perfect. And so Sean Connery himself was not a perfect man either. I mean, he was, in his first marriage, he had many affairs, subsequently got married, had still other affairs. And he did have a very cavalier attitude towards women. He was, quoted at one point saying that, women who sort of, are too uppity or whatever, they're just asking for a smack. I mean, and he was taken to task for this, and he regretted having said that. But I guess to some degree he did reveal a core belief and perhaps even a core behavior. So he was not a perfect man in that regard, and the fact that Venus is debilitated, reveals that, to some degree. But there you have it. None of us are perfect. But this is, I assure you, a remarkable case of a Neechabhanga planet. Follow those rules for resolution or improvement or reconciliation, and you can scarcely find another chart that has so much support for elevating a Neecha planet into that stratospheric level of Neechabhanga status. Okay, that's it for today. Tune in. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and there's more of this to come. Bye for now.